I'm Jim Baxter, and this is a lecture on community structure and diversity for general ecology. This is an aerial photograph of the Pantanal lagoons in southern Brazil. During the wet season, which is when this image was taken, you can see the striking green lagoons that are interspersed between patches of elevated forest. The Pantanal is one of Earth's largest wetlands. It occupies an area of up to 81,000 square miles, which makes it 10 times the size of Florida's Everglades. It's also home to an enormous number of species, including about 3,500 species of plants, 656 bird species, 325 fish species, 159 mammals, 98 reptiles, and 53 amphibians. Pretty impressive. Not to mention countless insects, fungi, and other microbes. And of course, with all these species, there are myriad interactions among them as well. For example, during the wet season, mammals such as jaguars and monkeys inhabit the upland forest patches until waters recede, but in the meantime feast on abundant fish and other aquatic wildlife, or other aquatic life that is trapped in the ever-shrinking pools with the onset of the dry season. I like this image because it illustrates the intricate patterns that can be created on the landscape by different communities, from the terrestrial to the aquatic. Each community has a distinct assemblage of species that make it up, and which interact with one another in many different ways, through feeding relationships, mutualisms, competition, and so on. These intricate patterns of species and their interactions are at the very heart of how communities function and the ecological benefits they provide. Today, I'll introduce ecological communities and some key aspects of their structure and diversity. Recall that an ecological community is an assemblage of populations of different species that occupy a different area and interact with one another. But first, here are the learning objectives of this lecture, and I'll let you take a look at these on your own. For now, let's continue on. Let's start by taking a look at communities on the landscape. Communities change across space and over time. These changes are due to many different factors, of course. As you move across a landscape, species that are present at one location change in their abundance and composition. For example, changes in physical conditions of temperature and precipitation as you go up in elevation affect whole assemblages of different species. This example here is from the Sierra Nevada here in California, and it shows the different major vegetation types that characteristically occur across this elevation gradient. An environmental gradient is a gradual change in abiotic factors over space or time. Environmental gradients are related to factors such as altitude, temperature, depth, proximity to moisture, water like the ocean, soil moisture, and so on. The abundance of species usually changes along environmental gradients in a more or less predictive way. If you've driven up into the Sierra Nevada mountains, you've probably noticed this. There are distinct changes in the types of plant species that occur as you go up in elevation. So you've probably noticed this, and you've noticed that there are recognizable communities of species that occur in distinct zones across this elevation gradient. This phenomenon is called zonation. Although the transitions between these major vegetation communities are depicted here as solid lines, don't let that confuse you, because the transition between these different major vegetation types in this Sierra Nevada actually happens gradually. And that's because abiotic conditions also change gradually with increasing elevation. But sometimes environmental gradients are steep, and the communities occurring along those gradients change rapidly over space. In the intertidal zone, we've already seen how species like the barnacles Semibalanus and Thamylus living in the intertidal zone change quite rapidly in their abundance over very short distances. And this is due to sharp transitions in physical conditions occurring in the intertidal zone, as well as species interactions like competition that we talked about earlier. Zonation in intertidal areas can exhibit quite distinct boundaries because high areas are subject to extreme dryness, while adjacent areas just below can experience near constant inundation. And of course, the tidal flow has a very, very strong influence on this. As a consequence of sharp transitions in environmental conditions over very short distances, the abundances of species correspondingly changes and can change quite rapidly. When we study communities and how they change over space, there are distinct areas of transition between different communities. These transitions between two distinct communities are called ecotones. This simple line diagram here illustrates the concept in which two different communities, 1 and 2, grade into one another through a transition zone that we call an ecotone. In California, serpentine soils are a common but rather unusual soil type in that they contain high heavy metal concentrations. In some places, the transition between soils derived from serpentine rock that has high heavy metals and non-serpentine soils can happen over relatively short distances. Because few plant species can tolerate the high heavy metal concentrations in these soils, transitions of the soil from serpentine to non-serpentine can strongly influence the above-ground plant community in terms of which species are present and how abundant they are. The illustration and graph essentially show this phenomenon. At the bottom, the bottom graph there shows heavy metal concentrations across a serpentine soil gradient. And so what you can see is that for samples taken along transects moving from left to right, that is from non-serpentine soils through the ecotone and then into serpentine soils, show a steady increase in a variety of different heavy metals, including chromium, nickel, copper, and so on. At the top, what you can see is that the distribution of plant species is depicted. And there are a variety of different species shown here, ranging from black oak to Douglas fir through yarrow, knotweed, and so forth. Each of these species is depicted here in terms of its distribution across this serpentine to non-serpentine soil gradient. At the top are the non-serpentine species, and these are like black oak and iris and so forth that really don't occur on serpentine soils at all. They may sort of extend somewhat into the transition zone, the ecotone, but they don't occur on serpentine soils because they're not tolerant of the heavy metals in the soil, among other things. At the other end of the gradient on serpentine soils, we see sets of plants like fireweed and knotweed and so forth that exclusively occur on serpentine soils, but never off serpentine soils. In fact, species like this are considered bioindicator species. If they're present, it means that there must be serpentine soils that they're growing in. Some species can actually occur across the entire gradient, and we call these generalist species. They occur both on non-serpentine and serpentine soils, as well as across the transition. And then some species actually are specific to the ecotone. They tend to only occur in the transitional zone. It's interesting to note that often the diversity of species is highest in the ecotone because it's the region where the distribution of the different communities actually overlap. These concepts of zonation and ecotone transitions between communities on the landscape suggest that communities are distinct ecological units with characteristic assemblages of co-occurring species. This notion raises a question that ecologists have had for quite a long time, over a century in fact, and that question is, how are communities organized? Let's look at two contrasting models of how communities are organized. The concepts originated early in the history of ecology and are associated with two key figures in ecology, Frederick Clements at the upper right and Henry Allen Gleason on the lower left. On the one hand, Clements argued that communities were natural units made up of species that evolved together over long periods of time to such a degree that they were interdependent on one another. This interdependent concept of the community essentially states that species depend on each other to coexist. In contrast, Gleason argued that communities are happenstance assemblages of species. That is, each has their own set of requirements, tolerances, and evolutionary histories, and they just happen to tolerate a similar set of environmental conditions and so therefore occur together. Although he did accept that some species and communities may have close associations with one another, he insisted that each species ultimately is its own independent ecological and evolutionary unit and should ultimately exhibit its own independent distribution. The interdependent model of community organization requires it hopefully is apparent that it requires that there's some kind of non-random process that is happening, that's structuring the community. These processes would be things like competition, predation, and mutualism, some of the interactions that we've already spoken about. Each of these is a more or less deterministic process because, as we've discussed, it can be important in shaping species niches in predictable ways and thereby determining which species are present and their relative abundances in a given community. On the other hand, the independent model doesn't invoke deterministic processes at all, but instead suggests that communities are inherently a consequence of random assemblage, and that species abundances and co-occurrences are simply happenstance and due fundamentally to the species' own individual requirements and tolerances. Because assembly of the community in this model is based on random chance, it's considered a null model. That is, deterministic processes that might give rise to positive or negative associations of species are considered not acting or responsible for structuring the community. The answer? Which one is it? Well, this debate went on for a very long time. Data has been assembled over the years to suggest that for most communities, although there is a degree of interdependence among species, and there are some coevolutionary phenomena that are occurring as well, what we see by and large is that communities tend to better fit the independent model. So let's look at some evidence to support that. A great example is the pattern of abundance of species across environmental gradients. As we just looked at, we were just looking at the abundance of different species across a gradient from serpentine to non-serpentine soil. In a series of studies of species abundances across pretty large-scale environmental gradients in the Smoky Mountains, Robert Whittaker, a very eminent ecologist of the time, demonstrated that the abundances of species across those gradients occurred in a more or less independent way. That is, each species showed its own characteristic changes in abundance across the landscape, irrespective of other species. The results in the slide show the abundance of 7 different tree species across a moisture gradient in the Great Smoky Mountains. The data were collected along line transects, which are simply samples that are taken over linear distances across some kind of environmental gradient in a landscape. When species abundances are collected this way, patterns of changes in species abundances across space, across the environmental gradient, can easily be seen. From these data, what you can see is that each species shows its own distinct pattern of abundance across this moisture gradient. And Whittaker also took samples across quite a number of other gradients and with the same results. From these data, what you can see is that each species, again, had its kind of own distinct pattern of increases and decreases in abundance over this gradient. Another way of looking at this is imagine that you were standing at any single point along this moisture gradient. You might be standing in a single forest stand somewhere. What you'd see would be a collection of different tree species, of course, and this might reflect a certain characteristic community. But from this vantage point, which is a fairly narrow one in terms of space, what you wouldn't see is that species are changing independently from one location to another. Many studies have shown similar patterns of species abundance across environmental gradients, and this has been viewed as evidence of the independent model of community organization. A very different kind of evidence in support of this independent model of community organization comes from a series of studies by Margaret Davis and her colleagues. Based on analysis of pollen grains deposited in lake sediments over the past over 14,000 years, Davis was able to reconstruct the historical migration of major tree species over this time period. The maps on the slide show 4 different tree species, hemlock, beech, chestnut, and hickory, that are characteristic of eastern deciduous forests in the continental United States. The isolines on the maps show the geographic range of each species at different points in time, starting at about 15,000 years ago and progressing to the present. If you take a moment to look closely at each of these maps, and I encourage you to do so, you'll see that each of the 4 different tree species exhibit quite different patterns of migration over that 14 to 15,000 year period. But how did Davis generate these data? How did she know where these trees were back then? Well, the technique that she and her colleagues used involved extracting fossil pollen grains from sediment cores that they collected from hundreds of lakes across the eastern United States. Pollen, which is released from the trees, is deposited annually onto the surface of lakes. Most of this pollen sinks to the bottom of the lake, where it becomes incorporated into the sediment. Over many thousands of years in these lakes, the pollen grains are laid down in the sediments layer after layer and form a record of which trees were present in the vicinity of the lake at the time. Pollen in these sediment layers can be identified, and because sediments can be dated using carbon-14 dating, the date when the pollen was deposited can be determined. So based on these data, Davis was the first to demonstrate that tree species individually showed strikingly independent historical patterns of migration that were different for each species that they looked at. Even though the species she studied were considered recognized members of the eastern deciduous forest communities we know today, individual tree species were actually behaving independently in their distributions over time. In other words, the forest we see today is simply a snapshot in time of a constantly changing forest assemblage in response to a continuously changing climate. And I failed to mention that over this time, this 15,000 year time period, of course, climate changed quite dramatically. We're talking about, after the Ice Age and the return of and the opening of land masses as the glaciers receded northwards in North America. So these 4 different tree species were basically following a trajectory of colonization of these new habitats as those glaciers receded, but they did so individually. So this evidence strongly supports the independent model of community organization. In light of current predictions, speaking of climate change, in light of the current predictions of climate change, climate conditions are changing faster today than they have at any time in the past. Consequently, some species will be able to respond to these changes, but others won't. The degree to which species can respond to the rapid rate of change that we're seeing today is going to depend upon the ability of those species to migrate, to move in response to those changing conditions on the ground and disperse to new locations with suitable habitat conditions. Of course, animals, because they're mobile, will be able to move or migrate and disperse populations to new locations as those conditions change. But for many plant species, this may not be possible. Some species can disperse fairly quickly. Annual plants, short-lived herbs, grasses, and so forth. But longer-lived plant species may not be able to keep up with these changes. For example, tree species. At the end of this lecture, we'll take a look at some real data, actually, and I'll pose a question for you to determine whether it's possible for some species of plants to disperse in keeping with the rate of change in climate conditions that we're seeing now and that are predicted to occur over the next century. In the meantime, however, let's turn our attention to another aspect of community structure, that is, trophic structure. As I mentioned, species and communities are connected to one another through a variety of feeding, or in other words, trophic relationships. Because of the web of different kinds of feeding interactions or trophic interactions that exist among species, these are called trophic food webs. This picture illustrates a trophic food web in a rather simple marsh system. And as simple as it is, it's still rather complex. In the diagram, oops, I advanced a little too quickly there. The arrows indicate how species in the food web are connected to one another based on their feeding relationships. The direction of the arrows indicate who eats whom, and thus the direction of energy flow in the system. At the base of the food web is where the energy enters the system. The basal species, called producers, are autotrophs. In this food, they're photosynthetic autotrophs, such as, photosynthetic autotrophs are virtually all the plants, but in this diagram also, because it's an aquatic marsh system, we also have submerged aquatic plants, phytoplankton, and so forth. So at the base of the food web, these autotrophs are referred to as producers because they're kind of producing the energy that becomes available to other levels in the food web. Energy that's assimilated by producers moves through a set of species called consumers, and consumers can be are herbivores or carnivores. Herbivores are primary consumers because they consume the producers at the base of the food web. Carnivores can be secondary or in which case they consume herbivores, which are the primary consumers, or they can be tertiary consumers, in which case they're usually top predators. In this example, the bald eagle, of course, would be a top predator. Top predators are referred to as such because there are no trophic levels above that predator that consume it as prey. Omnivores are also present in trophic food webs, and omnivores are organisms that feed at multiple different levels. And lastly, guilds are functional groups that feed on similar items within levels. Note that an important thing to note here is that there are more basal and intermediate species than top predators. This is because energy is lost at each step as it moves from one trophic level to the other. We'll talk more about this when we talk about energy in ecosystems later. Let's take a look at an interesting study that illustrates the complexity of ecological food webs and some of the kinds of interactions that occur. When considering interactions of species at the level of the trophic food web, species interactions can be either direct or indirect. That is, a predator eating a prey is considered a direct interaction because, well, for obvious reasons. There are also indirect types of interactions where one trophic level or species can affect another, but through an intermediate species. And so let's take a look at how this can happen. A fascinating study conducted near Gainesville in Florida by Knight and others demonstrated the degree to which direct and indirect effects among species in ecological communities can have important impacts on the overall trophic structure and or trophic structure of those communities. Knight and her colleagues investigated the effects of fish actually in ponds and the effect of those fish on pollinators of plants and as a consequence the production of seeds by those plants. So this was really a complex trophic study looking at how one trophic level can influence another both directly and indirectly through a variety of different kinds of interactions. What she and her colleagues did was they measured and compared abundances of both larval and adult dragonflies in and around 4 ponds that had been stocked with fish and 4 ponds that lacked fish. They also quantified abundances of pollinators, like this bee shown here, okay, and seed production of nearby plants. The example shown here is St. John's wort, a plant that occurred in the vicinity of these ponds. What they found was really pretty cool and fascinating. They found that ponds with fish produce fewer larval and adult dragonflies than ponds without fish. And this isn't surprising because fish prey on larval dragonflies and reduce their abundances. And if larval dragonflies are reduced, of course, adult dragonflies will also be reduced. This is shown as a direct negative interaction between the fish and the larval dragonfly. And of course, it's an indirect interaction between the fish and adult dragonflies. And that is indicated here by the dotted arrow moving from the fish to the adult dragonfly. In ponds without fish, there were more larval and thus more adult dragonflies. As a consequence, ponds without fish had fewer bees, flies, and butterflies visiting plants along the shoreline. Because the prey of dragonflies are pollinators of plants, this reduced potential seed production in at least one species, and that's shown here again as St. John's wort. Therefore, flowers in the vicinity of ponds without fish receive fewer pollinator visits than flowers close to ponds that were stocked with fish. Because the production of seeds is pollen limited, fewer pollinator visits resulted in lower seed production near ponds without fish. This study demonstrates that the presence of fish in ponds improves the reproductive success of a plant on land, and this is shown here. The graph shows the number of pollinator visits per plant between ponds with fish and without fish. And what you can see is that in ponds with fish, that the number of pollinator visits was vastly increased and significantly higher than that of ponds without fish. And this makes sense because, of course, in ponds with fish, those fish will consume larval dragonflies, which will then produce fewer adult dragonflies who, their absence, of course, would reduce predation pressure on pollinators, and so pollinator numbers would increase, and therefore plants would produce a greater, plants would be pollinated more frequently and therefore produce more seeds than when pollinators are reduced by increased predation by dragonflies, which would be produced in ponds with no fish, where those dragonfly populations would have increased dramatically in the vicinity of those ponds. This study demonstrates again that the presence of fish in these ponds significantly improves the reproductive success of plants in the vicinity through a complex set of trophic interactions. And we call this a trophic cascade. So the structure of a food web, that is, the relative proportions of producers and consumers and so forth, is influenced not only by the number of different trophic interactions among species, and we've just discussed some of those and how the complexity of those kinds of interactions, but also what are called trophic cascade effects across trophic levels, or just simply cascade effects. The previous example that I gave was a good example of a trophic cascade because of the multiple and sort of sequential interactions that species in trophic food webs have with one another, and how increases in the abundance of one causing decreases in the abundance of others can have indirect effects on, sort of downstream and across trophic levels. Such trophic cascade effects can alter the structure of the food web, that is, the proportion of biomass supported at the different trophic levels. This diagram shows the biomass at each of 4 different trophic levels in a food web. The number of individuals represent the amount of biomass in that trophic level. Often, there are no more than 3 consumer levels in a food web. And a question for you is, why is that? So this is a thought question that I'd like you to think about, but essentially you want to think about the amount of energy available at each level. As energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next, energy is lost in each transition, and by the time you get to the 3rd trophic level, there's relatively little energy left to support another level. We'll talk more about this later when we talk about energy in ecosystems. Overall, and as a consequence of the amount of energy available at each level, the distribution of biomass across trophic levels is such that producers generally have the greatest biomass, followed by the primary consumer, and then the secondary consumer, and so forth. Because of its shape in terms of the distribution of biomass, we refer to it as a trophic pyramid because it has a pyramidal structure. The basal species have more biomass and more energy, whereas top-level species have less biomass and less energy. But this also can change depending upon interactions among the different trophic levels in a trophic food web. For instance, we know that the amount of resources together with predation and parasitism that species experience can affect its abundance, and the same is true for entire trophic levels. When the abundance of a trophic group is determined by the amount of energy available from the producers at the bottom of the food web, it's referred to as bottom-up control. And this is shown in the left panel, where the more producers we have, the more consumers, both all the way up and down the trophic cascade, that we will see. So this is considered bottom-up control. When the abundance of trophic groups is determined by the existence of predators at the top of the food web, this is called top-down control, and this is shown in the right panels, where the number of top predators influencing the trophic level below it will have indirect effects on the distribution of biomass and therefore also energy across the trophic levels. That was the example of the data. The results from the Knight et al. Study were a good example of this. These are all examples of trophic cascades with different kinds of controls. Let's take a closer look at an example of top-down control. Approximately 60 years ago, in Yellowstone National Park, wolves were exterminated by hunting. Between 1883 and 1917, more than 100,000 wolves were killed for bounty in Montana and Wyoming alone. By the 1960s, they were absent from Yellowstone, and by the 1970s, they were listed as endangered in the United States. As natural predators of elk, the extermination of wolves in the park resulted in populations of elk building up. Without their natural predators, not only did the elk overgraze the grasslands, they also overbrowsed species of trees like willows, which occur along the riverbanks. This destabilized the riverbanks and caused the rivers to widen and erode. It also hampered beavers from reestablishing themselves in Yellowstone, which caused wetlands and wetland species to decline. Elk also overgrazed aspen trees and caused them to almost disappear from the park. So, wolves were a very important species, and that became recognized. In 1995, as a consequence, 31 wolves from Canada were reintroduced to Yellowstone. With plentiful food resources in the form of the elk, their prey, the wolf population grew and caused the park's elk population to correspondingly decline. Today, over 25 years after the reintroduction of wolves, ecologists have observed that willows are returning along the streams, and beavers as well, which build dams and create wetlands. Aspen populations are also recovering. In addition, wolf-killed elk are a smorgasbord for many species, ranging from grizzly bears and vultures to insect-eating songbirds. And these cascades are shown in the graph, the trophic cascade on the left without wolves, and the trophic cascade on the right with wolves, showing the enormous and various different interactions that the wolf as a top predator is influencing. So as a top predator, wolves have a very strong top-down effect on biomass distribution in Yellowstone that cascades across different trophic levels. In fact, their impacts even extend beyond that into the river hydrology. By causing willows to recolonize riparian areas, wolves also indirectly help to increase bank stabilization, as well as wetland formation and by dam building beavers. So wolves play an important role in ecosystems, and of course, as a top predator, can dramatically influence the distribution of biomass. Of course, we've talked about this a little bit, and we'll talk about it again. Wolves are considered keystone predators in this system. I want to shift now to discussing some of the ways in which different kinds of mechanisms can influence the species diversity of an ecological community. We've been talking about biodiversity quite a bit in the lab, and of course ways in which biodiversity or species diversity can be measured, but I want to focus now on the ways in which species diversity is influenced by several key mechanisms. The first is the presence of keystone species, as we just discussed with the wolves. These data here are data in which, for an intertidal community, where researchers, and in this case, a lot of this work was done by Bob Payne early in the 60s and 70s. And Bob Payne, by the way, was sort of the originator of the keystone species concept. What he did on intertidal areas is conducted removal studies where he removed Pisaster, the sea star, shown in the top figure there, from certain areas of the intertidal zone, and he allowed it to be present in some locations, and he excluded it from the community in others. The graph shows the species richness over time of areas where the Pisaster, the predator, was present, and where the keystone predator, Pisaster, was removed and so was absent. And what you can see is quite a dramatic shift in the number of different species that were observed in those intertidal systems where the predator was absent versus where the predator was present. And we've discussed this a little bit in terms of competition. And the reason that this is happening in this system, and the reason it happens in other systems, is that keystone predators modulate the abundances of other species, and those other species have effects on other species. And in this particular case, Pisaster reduces the abundance of populations of mussels and other organisms that are highly competitive that would otherwise outcompete other species in this system. And so when it is removed, those species, and you can see that in the bottom figure, the mussels actually overpopulate the area and outcompete other organisms and species for space. And so for this reason, the presence of Pisaster as a predator in this system is important in modulating the balance of competition, and therefore which therefore results in increased species diversity. The next example I want to talk about is the effect of fertility and how that can influence species diversity. And what researchers have found over the years is that fertility actually has, increasing fertility actually causes a reduction in species diversity. The results shown here are based on a long-term experiment called the park grass experiment that's been conducted in England. And what the researchers did was they added resources, both different amounts of resources and different numbers of types of resources, to different grassland plots over a period of many, many years, and observed in response the abundances of different species, but also species richness. What they found, and what other studies have found as well, is that as fertility increases, species richness declines. In this particular study, it actually was the amount of decline was related, the amount of decline that is in species richness was related more to the number of resources added rather than the overall amount of resources. The interpretation that these and other researchers have had regarding the effect of the negative effect of fertility on species diversity is that what it tends to do is select for competitive dominance. So species that are competitively dominant over others tend to do very well and outcompete other species in the system, thereby reducing its diversity. Another important factor that can have a strong influence on species diversity is what's referred to as habitat heterogeneity. And that is, habitat heterogeneity is simply the variety or complexity of different kinds of structures or niches, things like topography, slope, aspect, elevation. All of these variations in environmental conditions increase habitat heterogeneity. In fact, plants themselves and the structure of vegetation communities can also strongly increase the number and variety of different kinds of niches available to other species that rely on those plants. In this study, which was conducted by MacArthur and MacArthur in the 60s, they looked at this influence of plants on bird species communities, or bird communities, and in particular looked at species diversity in areas of forest where the foliage height diversity was either fairly minimal or was very high. So they measured the vertical complexity of different vegetation layers in forests, and then asked whether bird species diversity corresponded to that. And what they found was that when you have more vegetation layers, which increases the complexity of the plant community in terms of its structure, that is, providing more potential available niches for other species, they found that there was a significantly positive influence of this foliage height diversity on bird species diversity. The same relationship holds for birds over quite a wide range of habitats in North America and in other continents as well. And in fact, there are quite a number of different studies that have shown the positive relationship of habitat heterogeneity with increases in species diversity, simply because increases in habitat heterogeneity provide more niches for species to occupy. The final mechanism that I want to talk about that is a strong driver of species diversity is the effect of disturbance. Species diversity tends to be highest at intermediate levels of disturbance. And what I mean by disturbance is, and we've talked about this to some degree, is a disturbance is an event that dramatically reduces the biomass of individual species in communities in some kind of sudden catastrophic event. So, in other words, it kills lots of species, in most cases indiscriminately. Examples would be like, fire, hurricanes, floods, even volcanic eruptions at the very largest scales, or even at small scales, like a tree falling in a forest. Can disrupt the soil and cause destruction of species at the location of that event. Disturbances happen at different frequencies and intensities. And so the intermediate disturbance hypothesis is a hypothesis in which the intensity at intermediate intensities or intermediate frequencies of a type of disturbance, that the highest species diversity is observed at those intermediate levels. So, for example, if you imagine the return of fires at some particular frequencies, in systems where fire frequencies are very, very high, in other words, fires return very, very frequently, not many species can actually tolerate that high of a frequency of fire in a particular system. At the other end of the continuum would be a system where a disturbance in, say, for example, fire, the return interval is very, very long, and so there are very long intervals where there are no fires. This allows communities to establish much more fully, to the point where competition tends to start to be a primary factor in terms of which species are present in the community. And so where we have very infrequent or low levels of disturbance, this allows competition to reduce diversity, because the most competitive dominants are the ones that inhabit the community and displace other less competitively dominant species. The graph shown here illustrates that, and along the x-axis is shown the frequency or intensity of disturbance from very, very frequent or high intensity disturbances on the left, and on the right, very infrequent or low intensity disturbances. And in the middle, these are considered sort of intermediate levels of disturbance. On the left, where we have very high frequency disturbances or high intensity disturbances, those high levels reduce diversity, again, because not many species can tolerate high intensity or high frequency disturbances. At the other end of the continuum, species diversity is reduced because of the effect of competition, where competitively dominant species tend to displace other less competitive species. This is referred to as the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, or for short, the ID hypothesis. So let's take a look. I'd like to just present an example of that was actually conducted here in California, that I think is kind of a fun and interesting example. So there have been many different tests of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, but Sousa um, conducted a very interesting and I think elegant study that examined algal diversity on boulders of different size. And so let's take a look at what Sousa did. Sousa came up with a kind of a framework in which he, in his studies of algal diversity, these algal communities that he was studying resided on rocks along the intertidal zone. And what he realized was that the degree of disturbance to these algal communities in the form of these rocks being jostled around and scraping up against other rocks in storms varied by boulder size. In other words, it takes a lot more wave energy to knock around a large boulder than it does to knock around a small boulder. And in fact, his study design was that he looked at the algal diversity on boulders of different size. Small boulders being boulders that very frequently were jostled around because they didn't require, big storms to do so. And so those smaller rocks were argued to receive a higher frequency of disturbance than very large rocks, which wouldn't be jostled around by wave action very frequently at all. And then he also looked, of course, at intermediate sized boulders, which in this schema was received sort of intermediate levels of disturbance. So let's take a look at his data. Okay, sorry. So he argued that this established a disturbance gradient from very frequent disturbances in small boulders to very infrequent disturbances on large boulders. So let's look at his results. I'll just let you take a momentary look at these data and come up with your own conclusions. Did Sousa's results support the intermediate disturbance hypothesis? These data are means actually of species richness over several different sample dates for each of the 3 different boulder size classes. And at the bottom, the average of those averages for those dates across the different boulder size classes. So take a moment and think about that. Well, I think what you can see is that across the different boulder size classes, if you look at the different sampling dates, they're relatively consistent across dates. And when you look at the grand means for each of the boulder size classes, you certainly see that the intermediate boulder size classes tended to have, on average, the highest species richness. That is, species richness of algal species that occurred on these rocks. So this would seem to support the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, and in fact, these results were statistically significant. One of the things that I didn't show you are any statistics, but indeed he did conduct statistical analyses and found that quite consistently the intermediate boulder size classes had the highest algal diversity. This is one example of a study that has tested this hypothesis, but the intermediate disturbance hypothesis has been tested quite extensively in the literature, and for the most in the most cases there's support, but there are certainly studies that do not support the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, and to some degree it varies by the different kinds of systems and communities that are studied. One of the challenges is, of course, defining what intermediate actually is. So this would require knowing that your range of disturbances really is covering the entire range of frequency from very low to very high frequency. And so this has kind of been a debate among ecologists about how studies define disturbance frequency and intensity and so forth, and that sometimes that can have important, that can influence the outcome of the studies. But by and large, studies do tend to support that intermediate levels of disturbance can play an important role in influencing the species diversity of communities through the mechanisms that we discussed when we looked at that, the graph of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis model. The last concept I want to talk about today is how species richness in an ecological community can actually affect the stability of the community itself. So first of all, what constitutes community stability? Well, community stability is actually the ability of a community to maintain a particular structure. So communities can vary over time. They can vary under different conditions. In this case, what we're looking at is how stable a community is at different levels of species richness. So one of the most extensive experiments on this question was actually conducted in grasslands, where the researchers manipulated the diversity of plant species, and this was done in a prairie ecosystem in Minnesota. And they manipulated the diversity of plant species in these prairies by 1, 2, 4, 8, or 16 species. And you can see that in the 4 different graphs on the x-axis of plant species richness. Over a period of 11 years, they monitored the abundance of more than 700 species, and this was a huge study of invertebrate herbivores and invertebrate predators as well as parasitoids. During the experiment, when the environment varied considerably, the researchers asked which level of plant diversity provided the greatest community stability. And in this study, they measured community stability as the amount of year-to-year variation in the abundance and species richness of the herbivores and the predators that they measured. Now, to be even more exact as to what they did, in all of the cases, they measured stability, or they defined stability as the inverse of the coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation divided by the mean. And what that produced on the y-axis in these graphs, as you can see, is that increasing values of stability were determined by the inverse of this coefficient of variation. And that makes these graphs a little bit more easy to interpret, because higher values of this inverse coefficient of variation correspond to increases in stability. So let's take a look at the stability of herbivores. Starting with the graph on the upper left, what you can see is that an increase in the diversity of plants along the x-axis caused greater stability of richness and abundance of herbivores. So richness being in the left top graph and abundance in the right top graph. So this suggests that that plant species richness was tremendously important for maintaining the stability of these herbivore communities in these prairie systems. On the bottom, predator and parasitoid stability was also measured, both in terms of the richness and abundance. And so what you can see is that an increase in the diversity of plants also caused greater stability of richness of the predators and parasitoids, but it had no effect on the stability of abundance. So if the species richness of the plants in these prairie systems played an important role in sort of stabilizing herbivore and predator parasitoid communities, why might that have been? Well, the researchers concluded that the underlying reason that plant diversity led to increased stability of these higher trophic levels was because in the communities with the high plant diversity, those provided more consistently available food and habitat for the herbivores, predators, and parasitoids. So the stability of available resources for these communities was an important reason why those communities at the higher trophic levels were more stable as species richness increased. Similar patterns have also been observed in other communities where increasing species richness actually does seem to affect the stability of the community at other trophic levels. Okay, so to wrap it up, here's the question I told you about earlier, and I'll just quickly introduce it, and I'm going to post this question as a discussion on Canvas. Are rates of tree migration fast enough to keep up with climate change? And so for this question, I'm going to give you some information. It's shown here, but I'll also include it in the discussion on Canvas to take into consideration. And it's going to kind of require you to do a little bit of calculating. First, tree dispersal rates during the past 10,000 years are between 10 and 45 kilometers per 100 years. Mean global temperature is predicted to increase about 3 degrees Celsius by 2100, and this is the low predicted range, but we'll use it here as a conservative estimate. So if temperatures increase 3 degrees by 2100, trees would have to disperse 500 kilometers to the north to find the same climatic conditions. My question to you is this possible? Can trees actually keep up with this rate of climate change? So again, you'll need to do a little calculating, but I'll put this out there as a discussion on Canvas, and let's see what your answers are. Okay, that concludes the lecture on community structure and diversity. Thanks, and talk to you later. Bye.